Okay, welcome back to Law and Crime. So, defendant Jeffrey Tellis, who's accused in the murder of, Robert Tellis, accused in the murder of Jeffrey Gehrman, has just learned that his DNA, the defendant's DNA, was found under the fingernails of the decedent, the victim in this case. Pretty tough to explain in the absence of some sort of relationship. So let's go back in for more of this very important scientific information connecting the defendant to the crime.
Mr. Gehrman excluded?
Yes.
Let's talk about swabs from a hat that was identified to you as from a hat. This is states 285. Did you look at DNA data generated from a swab from this, well, identified to you as swabs from this hat?
Yes.
And what were your findings there?
So this would be lab item 20.1, swabbing from the inner hat pieces. The DNA profile obtained is consistent with a mixture of at least 5 contributors, with at least 2 of those being male. Due to the complexity of the data, no additional conclusions can be made regarding this mixture profile.
And when you say complexity of the data, in non-scientific terms, does that mean there's just too much information there to make it interpretable? Or how, in your words, how would you put it as a scientist?
So based on the data that was obtained, there was an indication that there were at least 5 people present on this item of evidence. So once we hit the point where there's at least 5, that profile becomes too complex for us. I cannot make any comparisons to any known reference standards, so I did not compare either Jeffrey Gehrman's DNA or Robert Tellis's DNA to this item of evidence. Once it was 5 people, at that point the interpretation stops. It is too complex.
Okay, and that's because there's just no indicator, there's a, I guess, a danger of interpreting data like that. It might not be reliable scientifically because there's just so much information, or?
Yeah, we can kind of relate it to there's just too much information, and also it relates back to based on validation data, and there's just too much.
Okay, so I'd like to move on to, I think your last report was from January 2nd of 2024.
Yes.
And you were given swabs from a vehicle, and then some swabs from clothing, and then also swabs that are reported to you as from some bushes at the crime scene?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, so all of the vehicle swabs, were you able to analyze the data as to those?
Yes, so every item of evidence that was sampled for this report did go on to DNA analysis, so DNA profiles were generated.
And what were the findings with regard to the swabs from the vehicle?
Did you want me to go through each?
Sure.
One? Okay. So referencing lab item 27, which is a swab from the interior driver door handle pull area. Assuming Robert Tellis is a contributor, the DNA profile obtained is consistent with a mixture, including at least 1 male contributor. Due to the limited nature of the foreign data, it's unsuitable for interpretation, and therefore no further conclusions can be made.
Okay. The next one, well, actually, let me just do it this way. It might be a little shorter. In all of the vehicle swabs, was Mr. Gehrman excluded from all of those?
He was either excluded or what we call uninformative.
Okay, and when it's uninformative, can you explain for the members of the jury what that means?
Yes, so uninformative, when I have that reference standard and I'm comparing it to the evidence profiles, we generate a statistic. So it's similar to the statistic that I've already talked about. If that statistic falls into a certain range, it's in what we call an uninformative range. So I can't say, yes, this person is included as a contributor to this profile, and I also cannot say, yes, they are excluded as a contributor to this profile. It's a range where we just can't say one way or the other if they're included or excluded, and that all relates back to the statistical number that was generated for that comparison.
Okay, and is there any further testing that can be done that would clarify that, or this is just kind of what we're left with the data that we have?
As of right now, this is the interpretation that was made and the statistic that was generated.
Okay, and though that includes all the swabs, well, with some degree, like you kind of made some distinction that some of them were uninformative, but it's fair to say that there is never a positive identification of Jeffrey Gehrman's DNA in the Yukon.
Correct. Jeffrey Gehrman's DNA was not found to be individually included or support for inclusion based on the statistic in any of those swabs that came from the car.
Okay, and some of them were uninformative, so we don't know, we can't say he's included or excluded due to the sort of limitations on the data.
Correct. There's not sufficient support for either way.
Okay, so I'm going to put on the overhead now states 166. And these are other items that you analyze, which are Sperry shoes, a right shoe, a left shoe, a shirt, and some shorts.
Correct.
With regard to those items of evidence, were you able to generate data and draw conclusions?
Yes, so for all, pardon me, I'm referencing my report. For all the items of evidence from these items of clothing, so just to reference, that's going to be lab items 35, 36, 37, 38, the clothing samples. Those were all consistent with one male contributor, and Jeffrey Gehrman was included as a contributor to those profiles, and Robert Tellis was excluded.
Okay, so the DNA that is gathered off of these clothing items that we've discussed was consistent with one person, and that was Mr. Gehrman?
Yes.
Okay, lastly, in that last report, there were swabs that were taken from 2 bushes and a butterfly, is that right?
Yes.
And I'm going to put on the overhead states 149, and those swabs were reported to you as AB3, AB4, and AB5?
Yes, that is correct.
And what were your findings with regard to those swabs?
These swabs were all consistent with originating from one male contributor. Jeffrey Gehrman was included as a contributor to those profiles, and Robert Tellis was excluded as a contributor to those profiles.
Thank you very much. I'll pass the witness, Your Honor.
You want a break? Okay, all right. At this time, we're going to take a recess. During this recess, you're admonished not to discuss or communicate with anyone, including your fellow jurors, any way regarding the case or experience, either by voice, phone, email, text, internet, or other means of communication.
All right, scientific evidence continuing in the Tellis case. Critical stuff. You can see the jury clock verdict watch is continuing there in the Lawrence matter, but we do believe they have another question from the jury in that case out of Florida. So we'll give you that as soon as it comes to us. Catherine Lizardo is here, and Mike Korbanix. So Catherine, I was expecting to hear a little something about the hat band and the hat having DNA of the defendant on it, but I did not hear that. I did hear DNA under the fingernails of the victim. So that's not good for the defendant.
Yes, definitely, because the defendant's DNA was identified in that, as we heard from the witness, they used the buccal swab method, and that's spelled B-U-C-C-A-L. I learned this from Linda Kenny-Bodden, and what that is when you swab the inside of the cheek. So that's how they found him, his DNA there. And the reason is because looking at the stab wounds of the victim, he had 6 stab wounds and 7 slashes, including slashing of his throat. There were signs of defensive wounds. So that's why he had DNA of the defendant under his fingernails. That's what this DNA analyst is saying from the report, that when they were doing their scientific analysis. And as we know, the defendant is claiming that he was framed for this murder, and he's actually claiming he was framed by the real estate firm that he had dispute with while he was in office. So that's interesting as to how that's going to play out during this trial.
Yeah, kind of a convenient other dude did it kind of story. So Mike, you got blood on the shoes that are weirdly cut up that happen to belong to the defendant. Now you got the DNA under the fingernail. I don't know. Need more? I'm still disappointed about the hat.
The fingernails is crucial, I believe.
In the absence of a relationship that we've not been told about, right?
Correct. And then plus the fact that it was at the home, I believe, and he doesn't live there with them or something like that nature, or they don't play sports together or something where you could say that. So it's going to be very interesting. And these are difficult cross-examinations, I believe, for the defense because, you know, the burden of proof is on the state to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. So the defense here has to be very careful as how they cross-examine because they may be just reinforcing and letting the jury hear again what was already said in the previous testimony, and that could be very strong for a conviction.
Not a great idea. Let me ask you a quick question here about the buccal swabs, which we now know how to spell. Thanks, Catherine. You don't need a search warrant for the buccal swab. Is that correct?
It depends on the state, but I believe once you have probable cause, it's not a Fifth Amendment thing because you're not giving words.
Yeah,
you're not giving words.
Like a blood test.
Yeah, right.
And that came just so we have the time frame figured out here. The crime was the 4th. The first investigation was the 5th. The buccal swab was the 7th. So that's how it all came together. Let's take a break. We'll come back. We'll give you an update on the Lawrence case, too, with the jury asking yet another question. Be right back.